Hello, everyone, and welcome to Growing Together, a gardening podcast with me, John Lamb, and Don Kinsler, a lifelong gardener and the North Dakota State University Extension horticulturist for Cass County. Don, how you doing today?
I'm doing great. Hey, I'm seeing pumpkins on doorsteps.
Pumpkins are all over the place, yes.
They are, sure sign of fall, autumn leaves, but the pumpkins on doorsteps with straw bales.
I think the pumpkins have come in before the autumn leaves this year.
I think they have. I've gotten kind of a kick out of it because, Mary mentioned too, when can we put out our pumpkins? I said, well, gosh, it seems a little early yet, but the time is coming.
Here we are, the last days of September, and we're facing, it's some 60s, but then we're going to get up into the 80s again.
Yeah. So, boy, nice long extended. And so early frost isn't going to happen.
Right.
Whenever we do get frost now, it certainly isn't going to be classified as an early type frost. So, yeah, gosh, I'm enjoying this longer fall weather to get some chores done and things. And, it's interesting. I mentioned the pumpkins. And I remember when we were kids, we actually grew pumpkins that we ate, for actual pumpkin pie.
Yeah.
They weren't the big jack-o'-lantern type. They were a smaller, classified as a pie pumpkin.
Yeah.
And I remember my mom and us would grow them. But I think they had a thicker meat in it. And they're smaller. And I think the quality must have been good, less stringy and sweeter. And so it's interesting. Now, technically, the canned pumpkin that we buy is actually a squash.
The squash, right.
And, I've had a lot of people mention to me that if you really want a good pumpkin pie, use buttercup squash as the ingredient. So it's just kind of fun. But, pumpkins are one of the type of vegetables that, man, they just say fall.
Yeah.
And it does bring up the great idea of just harvesting these things in the fall and preserving some of them for winter food supply. And so it's fun. I love this time of year, the crisp air, bright blue skies. I like that the sun is getting lower on the horizon and the shadows get kind of longer. Mm-hmm. And there's just an ambiance this time of year that just you don't find in other seasons. And I love working out in the garden.
Yeah.
Now, I haven't dug our carrots or potatoes yet, but that's fairly soon to come. And that's what I'm going to look forward to talking about today, how to store some of these things. But man, in the fall of the year, I love digging these things and harvesting them. There's just a quality in the air and in the sunlight that is it's refreshing.
Yeah, because here we are. Last 4 or 5 months, we've been tending to all these things, and now that they're certainly they're popped up, but some of these are ready to kind of pull out, and the kind of the fortunate or unfortunate thing is we don't have to eat them all right away. We can hold on to them. And let's start with carrots. How do you, first of all, let's talk about harvesting them. When do you know to harvest them? But then let's talk about after you harvest them, how to store them.
And it's fun with carrots to enjoy a few during the growing season, as soon as they get big enough to kind of eat. And gosh, that's fun just pulling or digging out a carrot, brushing off most of the dirt and kind of nibbling on it.
It's kind of this big reveal, isn't it? Because you don't know what shape it's going to be as far as like if it's going to have multiple limbs or
exactly.
if it's
or if they met a
or
stone down in the soil and they forked off, and so, it is fun. But now with carrots, they can remain in the ground, out in the garden, until the very, very end, almost to the point where, of course, you want to get them before the ground freezes so solid you can't get a shovel or a spade in the ground. But they actually do sweeten up. The starches and things that make up the carrot root will actually start to convert to sugar as the temperatures get cooler. So there's certainly a justification for leaving them in the garden just as long as possible. Sometimes I've delayed too long and we'll get fall rains, and then when I try to dig them, they're gooey with mud, which makes it more difficult. So I try to time it, leave them in as long as possible, but also get them before we get some of those rains that set in.
Yep.
But it's fun with those to get them just as sweet as they can. Now, carrots are fairly easy to store for the winter because all they need is basically refrigeration. Now, this whole thing about storing vegetables, including carrots, is just fascinating. Now, old homes, in pioneer days, I suppose talking the 1800s or even early 1900s, most homes had a root cellar, where all this produce would be stored for during the wintertime. And many of those homes also had that outside cellar door, that slanted cellar door that with both doors that opened up and headed down into the basement. And that was oftentimes it would go down close to the root cellar. So you could haul all your squash and your potatoes and carrots and everything else down there and put them in the root cellar, which was usually just a room partitioned off so it would stay good and cool. And sometimes even had a dirt floor, so you'd have that kind of rich humidity and things like that. And of course, those days are kind of gone. Although we live in an old house that was built 1895, and it was moved to Fargo. When it was in its original location, it had one of those outside cellar doors.
Oh, really? Yeah.
Yeah, and when we moved it to Fargo the first time, we didn't put that in. But of course, this would make a show all by itself, talking about that house move.
This old house.
Yes, when we moved it to a second time, we did put in that outside entrance, the cellar door, which would go down, because I like to grow carrots and potatoes, and I like to store them for the winter. And that makes easy access going down.
You don't have to go up into the house.
Yeah,
we
don't have to go through it. Don't have to haul, dirty dirt and stuff in through the kind of the living area. But it's interesting. Many of the newer homes now have kind of similar in the garage. Many newer homes now have an access to the basement through the garage, so you don't have to go through the living area. And so those are kind of neat types of things. And so it's interesting to think about today's modern homes, versus the old homes that had root cellars down in. So in modern homes, where are we going to store things, vegetables, that would kind of help them to store as well as they did in pioneer days, with that root cellar down in the basement? Well, refrigerators, some of the things that we talk about, including the carrots, store very well in a refrigerator. So maybe it's an old refrigerator, either in the garage or the basement.
Like a second fridge.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Or a person can partition off down in the basement. You can partition off a little kind of a closet type room that is separated from the rest of the basement so it'll stay cool. And if you have a preference, if it's kind of on an outside wall or a corner that's going to stay cooler, maybe there's even a little egress window or something that in the fall of the year you can open up, let in some cool air, and keep that little room separated off. Sometimes it's an area under the stairs going down to the basement that you could just kind of wall off and keep from the heat. And so there are different ways that you can kind of manipulate even a basement, or maybe it's in a utility room where you can, maybe it's where the washer and dryer are, maybe it stays a little cooler, or you can make it a little cooler. So there are some ways to kind of create those type of conditions that are required even in a modern home. So, let's get back to the carrots.
Yeah.
Okay. I mentioned carrots are actually easy to store because refrigerated type temperatures work well. So maybe it's the old-fashioned root cellars that would stay about 35, 38 degrees. And most refrigerators stay about that, 35, 37 degrees. And so carrots store very, very well. They would store most of the winter under those temperatures. Now, they like it moist. If they were just left out into the air, the carrots would dry quite easily.
Yeah.
So they store very well in plastic bags, maybe with a few holes punched in, so there's a little bit of air circulation, but that they stay damp. Many of the old timers, some people still do it, would put their carrots in tubs of sand. The sand would kind of keep a little moisture around them, but plastic bags really work just as well. So in a refrigerator or nice cool root cellar type, so when a person is digging them, carrots stay much better they keep much longer if they're not washed.
Okay.
There's something in the natural wax of the carrot that just helps it store. So at most, when a person digs them, if you just brush off a little of the excess dirt, and if you time it right so it's not gooey dirt that clings to them, with a little luck, it'll just kind of brush off, and then store them that way, and then wash right before you're going to use them. And then they'll just keep so much longer. It's kind of neat. Mother Nature has these built-in keeping qualities, such as that natural wax on the outside of a carrot. So that's kind of neat. And with a little luck, you'll keep carrots, maybe 8 months or so.
Really?
And just think of that. Gosh, that's good eating all winter long.
You have those at Thanksgiving now.
Well, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, and well beyond. And I should mention too on carrots. Okay, when you dig them, of course, you've got the green tops on, and they should be cut off about an inch so that you're leaving about an inch of that green part on. If you were to cut down into the shoulder of the carrots, then they don't keep as long. That would introduce some rotting type things.
Why do you want to keep an inch
itself. And so keeping the inch of the green, you're kind of the kind of the stems up on top. That will help the carrot root itself to stay more intact.
Okay.
And so then they'll keep better with that left on. And so anyway, carrots just absolutely fascinating.
One thing that we talked about, I think, a couple of weeks ago about carrots is that a trick, or maybe something to consider, that if it's getting cool but not cold, you said put a little compost, or not compost, but a little mulch, maybe mulch or straw over your carrots, keep them in the ground, and then that'll keep that sweetness kind of building, those kind of sugars kind of intensifying.
Yep.
And then it keeps the ground warm enough so that when it does get so cold, you can still go out and pull them up with some ease.
Yeah, because if the soil in our northern areas here typically freezes down sometime the first half of November, it varies by the season, to a point where you can't get a shovel in the ground anymore. Happens sometime the first half of November. But if you put a layer of straw, is a good example, could be leaves, even dried grass clippings if you collect those, and anywhere from 2 to 6 inches, the deeper, the longer it'll prevent the frost from going down in. And that can buy you some time. Not only will it give you more time to dig those carrots, but also, like you mentioned, John, it will give them more time to be in chilly soil and build up even more sugars. If you took that a real big step forward, some of the people will even cover them with a foot or more, or 18 inches of straw, and then during the wintertime, they'll go out and dig fresh carrots out underneath the straw. Because if you can keep the frost from preventing you from digging, you could potentially keep them all winter long out under the snow.
And the other thing that
I'm not quite so hardcore though.
No, that seems my first thought is, how do you find them if they're under a foot of?
Yes.
You have to kind of dig around there. But I think also too, for another practical reason too, is that it saves you space in your fridge.
Good point.
For other things.
Right. Good point. Yeah. So may as well store them out as long as possible, and save the fridge space. Well, next, which kind of has similar storage requirements, is the potato. And I love digging potatoes. I know you can buy potatoes fairly economical in the grocery store, but there's something about the homegrown potatoes that is just absolutely wonderful. And I like to grow them just because I like to dig them. It's like digging buried treasure under each hill of potatoes to see what you get. This growing season hasn't been one of the best ones. Maybe it's been a challenging season. So I know I've dug a few hills to start eating them, and they aren't the biggest, most prolific potato crops I've ever had, but it's good. And so anyway, for digging potatoes, we should wait until the vines, the above ground plant, is totally dead and brown. Then you know that they aren't going to increase in tuber size anymore, but they can remain in the ground. There's a natural inhibitor for sprouting. Sometimes you might think, well, gosh, if I leave those tubers down in the ground, if we get some rain, are they going to start sprouting and growing, and then it'll ruin the tubers? But no, they have a natural internal dormancy, so they can just sit in the soil and they're going to be just fine down in there. And I like to delay digging a little bit because the skins get harder, less apt to scuff up. If you dig brand new potatoes, for example, during the growing season, they're wonderful, but the skins are very, very fragile.
Very light, yes.
Yep. And so leaving them in, they're less apt to bruise. And so they keep just fine. But at a certain point, and I time it certainly before the soil freezes down. We don't want that, or the potatoes would freeze and turn to mush. But I like to time it so that I get them dug before we get a period of long fall rains. Again, so they come out fairly clean without a lot of mud clinging to them. Because just like carrots, potatoes will store better if we do not wash them. So when we dig them, if the soil moisture is just right or dry enough, they'll come out without a whole lot of dirt clinging to them, or you can just with a gloved hand brush them off a little bit.
Just as a rule of thumb, I know some people will store these like in their garage just for a couple of days, just to make sure that any dirt that's on there does dry thoroughly. And then
then it'll just rub off.
They can rub it off in the garage where if dirt gets on the floor, maybe it's not this big of a deal.
Yeah, and then another case for doing that, John, is after you dig them, potatoes like to be cured for at 50, 60 degrees, or even garage-type temperatures in the fall of the year, like to be cured just a little bit before they go into the cooler temperatures. This just kind of toughens them up a little bit. And like you say, any dirt that is clinging will dry, and then you can kind of brush that off before you put them in their actual storage.
But potatoes don't necessarily like to be refrigerated, right?
Boy, you're right. And the reason is, for the same reason that carrots get sweeter when the temperatures drop, potatoes, the starch in potatoes can convert to some sugar if they're stored too cool. And so while carrots love it at about 35 degrees storage, potatoes, if they're stored too cool, some of that starch will turn to sugar and they'll get an off flavor. And so potatoes, instead of 35 degrees, they like storage at about 40 degrees. Now, most of our refrigerators are a little too chilly. That's why you rarely see it recommended that you, even store-bought potatoes, it's not recommended to put them in your refrigerator because they'll develop that kind of off flavor. And it's interesting, if you were going to ever make potato chips, they will, how we'd like that, just that nice golden color on a potato chip. If the potatoes were stored too chilly and the starch converted to too much sugar, all of a sudden that sugar would caramelize and make kind of a darker potato chip.
Yeah.
An off-colored, almost too dark potato chip. So it's fascinating the way that storage, you might think 35 to 40, well, that's only 5 degrees, but that does make a difference. So on potatoes, we look for a spot, not in the refrigerator, and that's where our kind of root cellar type room comes in handy. If you can get a room in the basement that's about 40 degrees.
How long can a potato be stored before it does start to sprout?
Yeah, that's fascinating. If you can get that temperature at about 40 degrees, potatoes will store easily until about March.
Okay.
That's when ours start getting a few little sprouts peeking out the end of them. And so usually you should be able to get to about March. But again, it all depends on that temperature. The higher they are, the higher the temperature, the more apt they are to quickly sprout. And let's see. So we discussed not washing them. Is there anything else? Oh, very important on potato storage. They have to be kept in complete dark.
Okay.
Because when potatoes are exposed to light, they quickly turn green. And that's why in grocery stores they have to be very cautious to quickly rotate potatoes that they're selling. So if you had potatoes stored where they're getting light, both from the light of a room or through a window or something. For example, if you had a garage that was maybe kept at 40 degrees heated, you might think, well, gosh, that'd be good for potatoes. The temperature might be, but if they get light, they're quickly going to turn green. And that green compound in potato tubers has kind of a toxin in it, and so they're not to be eaten. So it's a shame to have potatoes turn green like that and then not be able to eat them. So if a person, for example, if your garage would stay 40 degrees consistently, might be a very nice temperature, but you've got to enclose those potatoes in a dark, black almost container so that they're not getting light inside. So no matter where you store the potatoes, very important to have them in the dark.
So it's okay to store them in something like that? I mean, do they need to breathe a little bit? Was there any concern about too much humidity or moisture in a sealed up box or so, or
yes,
box or bag?
There would be. Now, we mentioned the carrots like cool, moist. They like some moisture in a plastic bag, with some air holes. Potatoes like it cool. They also like it a little bit moist and humid too. So potatoes, like in a container, for example, a plastic tote, they are covered so that they're in the dark, but they like the humidity that is kept in too. Not overly moist. They don't want to be wet and damp like that, but they like the humidity rather than something that would be so dry.
All right. Let's take a quick little break. When we come back, we're going to talk about more things from the garden and how to store them.
Get 3 months of local news for just 99 cents a month. You'll get unlimited access to the news you need to stay engaged and connected to your community. Visit Inforum.com/subscribe now to get 3 months of local news for only 99 cents a month.
All right, we're back and we're talking about winter storage of fall harvest. So we talked about potatoes and carrots. What about beets?
Well, beets are handled much like carrots. And we've got to make sure that they don't freeze. If as temperatures start getting colder, we don't want them to freeze or they would turn mushy. But you can handle them just like carrots. When you dig them, leave about an inch of the tops intact. And so a refrigerator type temperature is fine, just like carrots. Maybe enclose them in a plastic bag with a few holes so you kind of keep that humidity up around. What's your favorite way of eating beets?
I roasted, heavily roasted.
Oh, sure.
I'm gotta say, I've had some roasted beets that I've liked, and I've had some that I didn't like. And I think
sometimes they can have kind of an earthy flavor.
Well, and then I think early on I had them like out of a can, and I did not like those. But I've had them roasted by people who know what they're doing, and they are quite nice.
Oh, yeah. I even like them steamed with butter and just a little bit of salt.
Well, it does sound good.
That's delicious. And parsnips. Parsnips are so closely related to carrots that similar type thing. The storage would be similar as to carrots, but also they become remarkably sweeter as the cool temperatures go. So parsnips can be left right up to the bitter end. And they can even be left in the ground over winter. And then early next spring, as soon as you can get a shovel in the ground, parsnips can be dug. They develop a really nice flavor even over winter. But if you left them in the ground too long next spring and everything thawed out, they actually could start growing and they get soft and mushy. Okay. So you've got to time it just right. The soil thaws, dig the parsnips. And so if you ever hear people saying, well, gosh, I dig our parsnips right away in the spring, that's certainly a doable way too. Maybe use some in the fall and use the rest next spring, or use the very thick straw method and enjoy them all winter long.
So really very, very similar to carrots except for you could keep them in the ground even longer.
Very much. And it's interesting. Parsnips, much depends on the variety of parsnip that you planted. There are some parsnips that become very long and tapered, and I can never get the entire parsnip out. Half of it is always down in the ground somewhere. And so, but if we choose some of the varieties that aren't quite so long, then you're more apt to get the entire parsnip.
It raises kind of a question. So if while you're in the harvesting process, if a couple of pieces break off like that, the best thing to do, I suppose, is just kind of eat them sooner than later.
Yeah, exactly. And we could have mentioned that with carrots too. If the carrots, if part of it snaps off and you don't get the whole thing, of course, those are carrots that probably will not keep as long because they've got kind of a wound on them. Yeah. Or if you're like me and you chop 1 and 2 with the shovel, as you're digging it. You didn't stay quite far enough away. And, then those are ones you could eat first. Same thing with potatoes. Murphy's Law on digging potatoes. The nicest potato in the whole hill is the one you spear with the shovel when you're digging it.
Yep.
but you can use those right away. And of course, that brings us to onions.
Yeah.
I love growing onions. So in homegrown onions, I know you can buy them in the store, but they just seem to have a more kind of intense flavor. Maybe it's my imagination, but the homegrown onions are just wonderful. And the time to dig is after most of the green parts, the leaves, the tops have fallen over. I like to leave them until the tops have really dried down, when they go from green to just a nice dry brown. So then you can go along, and sometimes you can even just pull them without even having to dig them, or gently dig them out, and brush the soil, excess soil away. The papery husks, the only thing that should be taken off is those that just kind of come off almost by themselves. You shouldn't peel the onions down, because those dry wrapper type scales on the outside help to keep the onions so they store better. And putting them in shallow trays and into the garage, that's one of my favorite things too in the fall of the year, is when you take these materials into the garage and let them cure. It's fun to see these trays full of onions. You go into the garage and you've got an oniony smell. And so onions should cure. They can cure easily for 4 weeks or so. Let them get nice and dry. And then they go into a nice cool storage. Now, we mentioned that carrots and parsnips and potatoes, they vary a little bit in temperature. But they all like it kind of humid. Onions like it cool, but they like it dry. If it was too humid, then they're more apt to start rotting. So onions like a temperature, probably around 40 degrees, similar to potatoes, but they would like the dry type thing, such as stored in open trays.
Is that why they're sold in mesh bags too?
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
Okay.
Whereas carrots are sold in cellophane plastic bags, to keep the humidity in. The onions are sold in the mesh bag.
How about exposure to sun? Is that an issue for onions?
Not really. It doesn't seem to be that same. It's not like potatoes. Potatoes are kind of unique that way, in that turning green like that. I've always admired people who braided the onions. Have you ever seen that?
Those are gorgeous.
And hung those up, it's just, man, that would be fun. That would be something to try. And of course, I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, pumpkins. And even though maybe a lot of pumpkins now, the actual pumpkins are used decoratively, it's still important to harvest them at the right time. And now is about the right time. But even like the buttercup squash and all these vine-type crops, gourds would be the same way, spaghetti squash, the winter-type buttercup-type squash, pumpkins. A good way to tell if they're ready to harvest is just take your thumbnail and try poking in the shell, the rind. If they're still soft and you can indent them, they should stay on a while yet, so they harden up. But if you can't indent them with your thumbnail, they should be ready to harvest. And rather than just trying to pull them off the vine, sometimes the neck, the stem kind of breaks off away from the pumpkin or squash itself. And so it's better to cut them with either a knife or a pruning shears, so you leave that handle intact. The reason for that is if the handle on the pumpkin or squash, if that comes off, it leaves kind of a little soft spot in which rot can come. And I've done that. I've grabbed a pumpkin by that handle,
Yep.
and the pumpkin fell away. And then if you feel that little spot that's exposed, it's kind of a little soft, and that's where rotting type organisms can enter. So especially on squash, winter type squash like buttercup or butternut that you want to keep all winter, store all winter, it's important to leave that handle, that stem intact. So cut it off of the stem. Now, there's nothing wrong with leaving those out in the garden until the vines have been killed by frost. The frost is not going to our first frosts of fall are not going to hurt the squash or pumpkins. It actually helps them kind of ripen up a little better. And then I like to leave the buttercup squash out there because then I can find them better when the vines all collapse. And, the frost is on the pumpkin. I suppose that's where that comes from. But pumpkins, we can certainly start cutting those and putting them on our doorsteps already.
What about, let's talk a little bit about some things that maybe we haven't gotten into the garden yet. Let's talk about storage of some plants. I'm guilty of this. I've got a couple plants that I've been meaning to get around to, haven't gotten around to yet, planting them, putting them in the ground. Is there any hope for me? Is there any hope for these?
Let's veer away from storing the vegetables. And what about if we have to store a potted shrub that we just didn't get planted, or you don't have what happens to me oftentimes, I see some really good things at the garden center and I buy them, but I don't have the space ready yet. And so you're kind of up against the clock because, the soil's going to freeze. We can certainly plant until October 1st is the preferred date, but that timeline's coming too. So what if I don't get the area ready that I want to plant these things? So I've got a few potted perennials, a few shrubs, maybe even a tree. How do we store those over winter until next spring? The preferred is not the garage. And the reason for that is garages, even if it maybe is heated a little bit, they vary. When it's 30 below, you open the garage doors to heat up your vehicle. In comes the cold weather, and you can get freezing, thawing, variation in temperature that could kill those trees, shrubs, or potted perennials. So a better way that really works well, I've done this for years, and that is to do one of two things. You can temporarily plant that potted shrub, pot and all, for example, in your vegetable garden.
Okay.
You can just sink pot and all. Keep the branches above soil.
Yep.
But sink pot and all down in the ground, and that will keep just very well. Water it first so it goes into winter hydrated, and do that before the soil freezes down solid. And then next spring, just lift it up out of that area, plant it where you want to. You see, the big mass of soil, the mass of surrounding soil that is in is going to keep it moderated. If that same pot were left above soil line, then it's just the sides of the pot are exposed to too cold of temperatures, whereas down in the ground, it's got that big mass of soil to moderate. Another thing that a person could do, if you don't have a vegetable garden or somewhere to sink pot and all down in, you can put it up along the house foundation, not on the south side, because in the winter, the south side warms up artificially, from the sun. So east, north side is actually pretty good. West side, up right against the house foundation, because that'll be a little more moderate in temperature, and then cover it with leaves or straw, a couple of feet of leaves, and kind of buried in like that. That should hold well all winter long, and especially if it's an area that will catch some snow. I like to turn those, when I'm doing it that way, I like to lay them down on their side. And that's the way, by the way, that's the method that garden centers use to winter all of their pots. You might wonder, well, how do the garden centers do this with the material they've got left over? Well, what they do is they lay all the pots down, lay the trees and shrubs down, kind of down on the sides, and then they cover the whole works. They've got insulated blankets now that they use to roll out over the nursery stock. We used to, before those blankets were invented, we used to just use straw, cover the whole works with straw, and then in the spring, uncover it, tip them back up, and you're good to go. So there are good ways to winter shrubs, perennials, trees that you didn't get planted. And so every year I find myself doing that, temporarily kind of healing them in somewhere and getting them, and then they're fine the following spring. So much better than trying to put something in the garage. That's a little iffy. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't.
If I am able to get a couple of my shrubs in here this last week of September, should I be doing something like putting mulch around the base of them, just to kind of stave off any kind of sun cool or anything like that?
Yeah, and the advantage of putting mulch on around a newly planted shrub or tree in the fall here, I like the shredded wood material. That in a layer anywhere from 3 to 5 inches is the recommended. and that will keep the soil warmer longer, and it will help prevent the fall cool down from going as quickly down into the soil. So the soil won't freeze up solid as quickly, and that buys a little more rooting time. So that mulch in the fall is quite important.
All right. Don, this has all been really fun and really great to know, especially, you, like I said, you've been spending 4 to 5 months growing these things. You can't eat them all at one time, so you're going to have to hold on to them. And it's nice to know to get these kind of tips for how to store our fall vegetables and our fall produce so that we can enjoy them for quite a long time. It is.
And, I never get real sad at the end of the growing season because there's so many of these things to kind of enjoy. And it's already fun to be thinking about next spring already.
Yeah.
I'm already thinking about the different flowers, vegetables, and different things that I've grown this year. And I'm already looking forward to next spring.
Well, if people have questions for you about fall harvest or spring planting or anything, what's the best way to reach you?
Send me an email, donald.kinzler, KINZLER, @ndsu.edu.
All right. Well, thanks again for coming by, Don.
Yeah, thank you, John. Thanks, everyone, for listening. Have a good week.